Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we are going to be shifting away from training and we're going to be talking about providing a species appropriate lifestyle when gentling. And I underlined when gentling because this is specifically for the gentling process time frame only. Okay, this is not what I would consider an appropriate lifestyle once your horse is gentled. We will get into this and I'll explain why. But I figured this would be a really important subject to talk about because I know that there are some events coming up like the January internet adoption and people might be considering getting a Mustang for 2026. It is the year of the horse, so get yourself a horse in 2026. But I wanted to touch base on some really important considerations before you go and even consider getting a Mustang. So this is going to be a really important video that I hope you guys are able to get a lot out of and also just have something to really consider. This is going to be an opinion-based video. There's going to be information regarding BLM requirements, U.S. Forest Service requirements for Mustang adoption, and I will tell you what is legally required versus what I am, giving my own opinion on. But this is a really important topic, so thank you for being here, and let's dive right in. Alrighty, so let's first discuss some facility requirements. I do have one note here that's bulleted about footing conditions. This is not a BLM requirement. It made its way onto the slide by accident, but it's still important, and obviously we're going to talk about in this video. But everything else listed, the corral space, the fencing, and the shelter are BLM required rules for adoption. Like, you have to meet these standards. So ignore the footing conditions for this one. It is not required. We are going to talk about that in this video. It just happened to make its way on this slide, so I just decided to leave it. So let's first begin by discussing the square footage of corral space that's required. So they state to provide a minimum of 400 square feet of corral space. That's 20 by 20 feet. I'm going to just state, and here my opinion is coming into play here, that is an insufficient amount of space to gentle a Mustang or to even have a horse, period. I know that gentling pens are very different than what ends up being like turnout paddocks. My gentling pens are not nearly as large. My horses have to be gentled before they can go out in my bigger paddocks. For safety reasons, they need to be able to be caught. I need to be able to handle them. If they were to jump out of the paddock, I need to be able to catch them. I have had a gentled yearling, she's a yearling, clear my 5-foot fencing. Unfortunately, she was gentled and I was doing herd introduction, so she had a halter on and she was easy to catch, but I couldn't imagine if she wasn't gentled what I would have done in that situation. So make sure that you're providing a sufficient amount of space for your horse where they can still be a horse on the off time that you're not gentling them. And I'm going to discuss this again further. I have some photos of kind of the setup that I have found works just based off of setups that I've used in the past that I haven't been too pleased with versus kind of what I have now. So just because the minimum is 400 square feet, please provide more space. It does not need to be massive. Like I said, you don't want something that's so large that you can't get near your horse because they need to be gentled. You want to be able to handle them in a case that they get injured or they colic or something's going on. So you don't want to just turn them out in this huge pasture, nor really can you. So just keep in mind that having something that's even like 40 feet by 40 feet, which is typically what I have used in the past, works really well. Just make a note, okay? Try not to just have this small, bare minimum space for your horses. It's just not fair to them. And it's just not enough space to gentle. You don't know the type of horse you end up with. They may need a lot of distance between people or else they're trying to scale the fence. So just keep that in mind. All right, and the next note is footing conditions. And we're going to talk about this a little bit on a few later slides. So I'm not going to discuss this too much. Are we talking about this later? Yes, we are. Okay, great. Okay, I have my notes here. Footing conditions should be free of severe mud, rocks, and other hazards. Again, this is not a BLM requirement. This just managed to get on the slide, but we'll talk about this in a few slides. And then next is fencing must, keyword is must, be 6 feet tall for an ungentled horse or something that is 2 years or older. 5 feet tall for a yearling or gentled Mustang. You can adopt gentled Mustangs from the BLM, or you can adopt them through reassignment, and we'll be talking about that later. And to that, you only need 5-foot fencing for them. And then lastly, 4.5 feet tall fencing for a burro of any age. So we're going to talk about fencing as well. And then lastly is the shelter. So depending on where you live, the BLM has requirements, minimum shelter requirements per state. And I copy and pasted the photo directly from the BLM site that has the states listed, the minimum requirements, and examples. So go ahead and find your state listed there and see the minimum requirement. You need to have these things. You will not be approved on your application if you don't. So make sure you have these shelter requirements. Alrighty, let's dive into what I believe is the most important factor to consider when getting an untouched horse. I cannot emphasize this enough, how important it is to have proper fencing. As I stated on the last slide, there are fencing requirements per the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service. You have to have 6-foot tall fencing for an ungentled horse that is 2 years or older, 5-foot fencing for a yearling or a gentled horse, or 4.5-foot fencing for a burro of any age. So we're going to be focusing on 6-foot fencing for the purposes of this video, because that is what differentiates adopting a Mustang from adopting or purchasing any other horse. Not only is it a requirement from the BLM to have 6-foot fencing, I am going to strongly encourage it, okay? Like I said, it's a requirement anyway. But I do know some people that like to lie on their adoption application forms and say they have 6-foot fencing. In reality, they only have 5-foot fencing. The 6-foot fencing is to keep the animal safe. You want to keep your horse safe. And I have seen firsthand Mustangs jumping 5-foot fencing, clearing it. And these are gentled horses. Sometimes they don't clear it. But I cannot emphasize enough that it is so important to make sure that you not only have 6-foot fencing, 6-foot tall fencing, but it is safe for the horses. So we're going to talk about 2 of what I believe are the safest options for 6-foot fencing, and then we'll discuss some things that I just wouldn't personally recommend. So the first being wooden fencing, as seen on the right with my leaping yearling Roulette. She's actually about 2 years old now. But she's in my wooden round pen, so I do not use this for gentling. I replaced my metal panel round pen with this wooden structure. But it serves the same idea, the same point I'm trying to make here, of having something that's tall, solid, safe for the horses. They cannot jump out of it. It's probably like the best option you could use, because you can start training them to tie to it, and it does not move, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it's probably a fairly inexpensive option if you have, long boards, and obviously you don't need to do as many boards as I have on mine. I did that for kick boards for the bottom, so we could start horses and not have issues with, anything going on and going wrong. But I would recommend probably a wider gap between rails on your wooden fencing. But that is probably the safest option that you could do. Alternatively, you can purchase what I use for gentling, and they are heavy-duty steel livestock panels. So you can see on the left picture with me gentling one of my geldings, Renaissance, who's now found a new home. He's been with the new owner for a little bit. He is in the steel panels that I still use to this day. If I could redo my property, I would, without a doubt, put up a permanent Mustang gentling pen that's 6 foot, made out of wood, but I could not have anticipated getting as involved with them as I did. So I kind of don't have that option anymore, or at least right now, without taking down my other fencing. But the steel panels are great. They are heavy, like I said, heavy duty. So the horses, even if they bang into them, which some of them that happens, they don't bend in half like the 5-foot panels you can buy at Tractor Supply do. And they can be moved. So you can make the pen bigger, you can make it smaller, you can put it in a different location. So that's kind of the really nice perk of those. The downside to those is sometimes the horses will stick their heads through the panels, and some of them know to get their heads out of the panels, and some of them panic and pull them, and It's never easy to watch a untouched horse do that. My yearling Roulette, who's the one pictured leaping, she had done that, and fortunately she was mostly handleable at the time, and she got out on her own, but I still look over and heard the panels crashing around while she was in there, so that was not the prettiest sight. So there's gonna be, pros and cons to all sorts of things that we use, but those two are arguably the safest option. I would not recommend using chicken wire, or, God, I don't know, something flimsy to make 5-foot fencing 6 feet. It's not just visually making them stay in the pen, but it's actually providing structure. So if they do try to jump out of the panels or the pen, they aren't hurting themselves and they're not getting out. The big thing is keeping them where they should be, because some of them take a little bit more time to gentle, and you would not want an untouched feral horse getting out and roaming around. My gentling pens are within a paddock, so I kind of have double safety in that regard, but not everybody has that, nor do you need to do that. It's not a requirement, it's just what has worked for me in my setup. But you definitely want to make sure you have nice solid fencing. Even having like the 5-foot panels or wooden fencing that you attach like brackets and put up an additional foot, like even that is okay, and you'll definitely be approved for that. But there's certain things like chicken wire and other wire types that the BLM often does not approve of. So just make sure you are really considering nice, good quality fencing. I know it can be a bit of an expense up front, but especially if you plan on gentling more than one horse, down the line, investing in some really good fencing is gonna be very nice. You're gonna appreciate that. So just something to really consider is the fencing. And here's just an example of one of my setups I've had in the past, and I'm sorry it's not like the best photo, but you can see how I live in New Hampshire, so my requirement for a shelter is a 3-sided structure with a roof. So I have a really large lean-to. It's about a 12 by 24. So I just divide it in half and give the untouched Mustangs half of that lean-to so my other crew can have the other half. And I just have the panel set up where it's like a semicircle, and then the rest of it, which is out of frame, is up against my fencing. But it's inside of my pen with the other horses, and we're actually going to talk about that next, is quarantine and all that. But I wanted to just show you just what one of my common setups looks like. Let's talk about quarantine. Do you do it? Should you do it? Do I do it? Should I do it? So this is, of course, going to be up to the adopter and what they feel is necessary and what they feel most comfortable doing. So a few things to note: that these horses coming from the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service, they're not coming from auctions. They're not coming from these places where we have a bunch of unvaccinated horses coming in and out. These horses are staying at these particular holding facilities out west, and they will be coming with a health certificate, especially if they're traveling state lines. If you're adopting directly from the corral, you'll probably have to get one if you're traveling state lines, but if you're picking up from like an adoption event or an IA pickup, they will have a health certificate with them. So that said, they are vaccinated. They receive a lot of vaccines, and they're up to date on their vaccines because they have to travel state lines, so they have to make sure they have all of that. I do recall, I think one of the most common concerns is with strangles. I recall there was an internet adoption that happened, I think it's 2 years ago now, where there were many horses from a corral listed, and one of the horses from the corrals, I don't know if it was the one listed or what, had developed strangles. So they ended up pulling all of those horses from the IA because they said we cannot transport these. Even though some of the events weren't going to be for months, they do not gamble when it comes to that sort of thing. So those horses did not transport. No horse left the facility until that was all cleared up and everything was fine. I do believe I have heard that a case of strangles has happened. So that is absolutely, this is not to say it's never going to happen. It's not to say that these horses are 100% healthy with anything. We always want to be super cautious, when we're getting new horses that are transporting, especially if you're getting a hauler. You want to be cautious of these elements. So I always say I leave the quarantine idea up to the individual adopter and the person that's getting the horse, So this is totally up to you. I'm not going to steer you one way or the other. This is just whatever people feel most comfortable with. The challenge, so what I do, knock on wood, I've never had an issue. I always have my pens, like you see in this photo here, directly in with my other horses. So they do end up being nose to nose at some point. It's not like they're sharing hay or sharing water, but they are sniffing each other. And again, knock on wood, I've never had an issue. If I did, that would be something else that I'd have to address and figure out. That said, I have had horses when I have gotten them from an event where I put them in a paddock and my horses have to be separated while I bring the truck into the paddock and unload the horse and then take the truck out. So the horses are typically like by themselves in the pen for like 10 minutes, 20 minutes, not long. But I have had horses that have tried to jump out of my pen to see my other horses, to be with my other horses, because when you think about it, like what's going on in their lives in that moment is terrifying. They not only were gathered, processed and holding, moved to an adoption event, so they were probably on a truck for a few days, and they take breaks. I'm not saying that they don't. I'm not trying to villainize this process at all. Even domestic horses have to do all of this sort of stuff if they're competing and they're traveling around the world, or they're being sold and they have to go across country. Like, this isn't new for the Mustangs. My point is, it's hard for them to kind of grasp what's going on. So I do my best to, when I'm putting them in a paddock, unloading them off the truck when they're going into their gentling pen, I try to just make things as quiet and chill as possible. And the best way that I have been able to do that is to have my own horses, my quiet, gentled, calm Mustangs, be able to see the new ones and eat around them. I put the bins near the paddock, and it just keeps everything chill. And after like a week or so, they really do calm down a lot. And then my horses can kind of walk away, and the Mustangs that were previously what felt like super herd bound, though that's not quite what's going on, they calmed down a lot and they were cool with like the other horses leaving them. So it's like the first few days that they're kind of really on edge. And again, it makes sense why they are. So you need to consider that if you're going to quarantine, that your horse really might want to try to get to your other horses. So just have like a backup plan in case you need to do something about that. And we're going to talk about my kind of new setup for how I am approaching that problem in a little bit. But again, if you have two horses coming, that's really not a big deal. You can quarantine the two together. So I just wanted to talk about that briefly, but again, it is up to every individual. Whatever you feel most comfortable doing, you absolutely can do that. Alrighty, let us discuss footing. I had this bulleted on that first slide. Like I said, that was an accident. It made its way up there. Footing is not a BLM requirement, okay? But I do want people to really think about where their horse is going to be living, because, I don't know about where you guys are, but I live in New Hampshire, and we have maybe 3 months of nice dry footing before everything's wet or icy or snowy, or it's just a mess. So I have taken a lot of time to redo a lot of the footing in my paddocks because I want my horses to be healthier. I want them to have minimal thrush. I don't want them to develop scratches. I want them to be able to run and not be slipping and sliding on the loam that we have in one of the paddocks. So there's just a lot of things that you want to consider before you bring a Mustang home, because once they're home and in that pen, there isn't a whole lot you can do, especially if they're not handled and you can't move them. So think about having some really nice footing. I use a stone dust sand mix. It works really, really well. Whatever works for you and your environment. Like I said, I'm in New England, so we get a lot of water, and the stone dust and the sand work well. And it's pretty low dust as well in the summers when it is super dry. So it's a really nice footing to use. Easy to drag, isn't like a clay, so it doesn't get slick, so the horses can really kind of rip around, and I feel safe with them on this footing. So you definitely want to have something with some good drainage, and the stone dust sand mix is good for that. The other thing you want to consider are that these horses, they are trimmed in holding, but depending on when you pick your horse up, they may be due for a trim, or they may not have gotten to it. Who knows? So they could often have quite long toes. I've had horses come in that have just been previously trimmed and their feet are short, almost sometimes too short. And I've had horses that have come in that hadn't been trimmed for months and desperately need a trim. So one of my recommendations for that as well is to throw some crushed stone around like the water troughs, not around maybe the whole thing, but around parts of it, so when they're going to drink water, they're kind of stepping on those stones, and it might help kind of break off a little bit of that wall. I would not recommend putting this by their feed because you don't want them around that all the time, but just a different spot that kind of helps, that they don't go to every, that they're not spending all the day at, like a water trough, right? Just to have a little bit of that texture to kind of chip away at those feet a little bit. So it buys you some more time to gentle and get them more confident before you can have the farrier out. All right, I know I mentioned that fencing is the most important thing to consider when adopting, and arguably, yes, for the purposes of setting up your facility for Mustang, fencing is absolutely the most important thing to consider. However, in regards to just horse ownership in general and providing a species-appropriate lifestyle for your Mustang, food is arguably the most important thing to talk about. So horses are non-ruminant herbivores, meaning they have a single stomach. And relatively to the size of a horse, the stomach is quite small. So what we want to be doing is we want to be providing hay 24/7, but we want to be doing it in a manner that isn't rushed. It's not these large meals. We're able to kind of mimic a little bit of that natural grazing pattern that horses do and should be doing. So whenever I get a wild horse in, I have kind of my go-to setup is a 2-inch sized hay net, 2-inch hole size hay net, and I've loose scrap hay on the sides. So the horses are learning to eat out of the hay net, but they're not forced to eat out of the hay net, where they can also grab some loose hay on the side. And as they get their weight back on, and as they kind of figure out the hay nets, that's when I start to lower the size of the holes so that it eventually gets a little bit more challenging, takes a little bit longer for them to eat it, until eventually they figure out the super small holes, which work great. The horses actually really enjoy the enrichment. I have tried I'll put scrap hay and the hay bag in one space, and a lot of the times they eat out of the hay bag. It's really quite interesting to see, because I think they enjoy getting those smaller bites instead of these big mouthfuls of hay that takes them longer to chew. So the hay nets really work. They're great for mimicking that grazing, and especially my large herd, I've got, I think, 8 hay bins out at one time, maybe 9. So the horses are actually traveling from bin to bin as well. So it really acts as a good mimic for what they would be doing in the wild, or what they did in the wild, right? So even when gentling, though I only typically have 1 bin in the pen at one time, providing the 24/7 hay in that hay net allows them to have that kind of natural mimicked grazing opportunity. And, one thing to really consider is having hay 24/7 really does a couple things. It eases the ulcers a bit. A lot of the horses will come in with some ulcers, and obviously we can't test for ulcers, but they just are, the signs show. So having that hay 24/7 just is going to help the stomach, make sure that the stomach acid isn't building up. That's kind of the problem with horses. They don't have a gallbladder, so they get bile and all this fun stuff. So having the hay 24/7 eases the stomach quite a bit. And it also helps when we're doing clicker training and positive reinforcement, because the horses aren't going to be super stressed about the food because they are not, quote unquote, hungry. They have had food, they have access to hay, they're not going to have all these big feelings about food being presented, as opposed to horses that are fed meals that are more amped up for food time. That poses a challenge when we're doing positive reinforcement. So that's just something to take into consideration. So the other thing about the horse's digestive system, their large hindgut is the main site of fermentation, and in that idea, we want to have a diet that is forage based. So again, this is hay, grass is hay. That's sort of the idea that you want to be providing to your horses. So my horses all get first cut Timothy hay. Again, I am not a nutritionist. This is not me speaking with a degree on this subject. I'm coming from what I know, what I've read, what's been taught to me, all of these factors that go into providing a food, the proper feed for your horses. So horses should be on a forage-based diet, And First Cut Timothy works really, really well for offering that consistent feed. Another thing to consider is adding a mineral balancer and salt into a soaked hay pellet base. So I give my horses Vermont Blend. I'm going to show you on the next slide the things that I provide. I live in an area where we just have some mineral deficiencies here from the hay that we have. So my guys get a mineral balancer, and then they get the salt as an additive to help increase hydration. I want to make sure that my horses are drinking. Again, we want to have a diet that works best for the horse's system because our Mustangs may not be gentled right away, and we definitely do not want any sort of colic situation. So I provide as much as I can to limit the idea of that happening. And the mineral balancer and the salt get added in, like I said, that soaked hay pellet base. I like to use soaked alfalfa pellets because I like to get a little bit of protein. And the alfalfa pellets, again, they help with the ulcers a bit. So that's a really good option to utilize. And we're going to talk more about hay pellets when we do positive reinforcement work. But always soak these pellets when you're feeding them in this quantity. You don't want your horse to choke. So I often soak them for 24 hours. I soak them overnight, and I put all of my supplements in that. And then one thing I've been reading more so on in a lot of the forage-based nutrition groups is adding a fat content. And people have recommended rice bran, golden flax, or flaxseed. I have given flaxseed oil as a fat for some of my horses, especially some of mine that were on vitamin E. But I have not had personal experience with these things. I have not added them yet. But I'm going to look more into that and read more into that. And lastly, for food is water 24/7. Okay, we need access to water 24/7. And please consider, if you live in a cold climate, getting a water heater, making sure that water is not frozen. I know wild horses live out in the wild and they go paw at the water ponds and they drink water that way. They no longer have to do that. They live in the luxury of domestic homes, so we should try to be providing them with that water 24/7, which is only going to aid in digestion, which is, again, going to help prevent colic. So just some things to make note of in regards to a species-appropriate lifestyle feed regimen. So here are some of the products that I commonly use, and I am not sponsored by any of these brands, but they are a frequent for me, so I wanted to outline them just to kind of give you guys some direction in what to purchase. So the alfalfa pellets, whatever you can find access to. I use the Stanley pellets. There's other brands. Whatever pellets work for you, whatever you can get access to, should be fine. Just make sure that they're pretty much mostly alfalfa. Sometimes they like to add in some other ingredients, so just double check that. Then we have Spirulina Chia, which is from Stable Feed. This is a chia supplement, and this supplement is amazing. The boosted one especially. I have used this supplement for so many things, whether it's a horse has a cough, or one of my Mustangs, Winter, developed a severe summer rash a couple years ago. Bug reaction, but it was like, oh my God, it was such a nightmare. That supplement cleared it. It helped with some weight on another horse. It's helped heal cuts and wounds. Like, it's just such a great supplement to use. So I'm actually going to be starting to use this when I get Mustangs in, just to kind of give them a little bit of a immune boost, to make sure that they are feeling good, because the travel is a lot for any horse. And it's just a really nice, quick, easy thing to add into their soaked alfalfa. And then next is the Vermont Blend. So this is that product that I use. This is the mineral balancer. This is from Custom Equine Nutrition. They have so many amazing products. Again, I'm not sponsored by them. I wish I was, but they have amazing products there. Lots of different varieties, so definitely go check them out. And then lastly is the hay bags that I use. These are from Hay Burners. They are good quality bags. I use these bags religiously. I use them every single day. I have had these bags for years. They do not tear. They are like the nicest quality bags I've ever seen. And they make all different varieties, different size holes, different size bags, good for round bales, good for square bales, like single size bags. Like, they are great. So definitely go give those a look and go get some of those bags. Let's talk about friends. So I mentioned earlier that we would be discussing turnout and better ways to make our horses that are being gentled have a somewhat normal life. Again, they're going to be confined in a space so we can get them handled and gentled so they can then go out and live a normal life. But we can still try to provide as much as we can while we are gentling them. Because like I mentioned, we're only gentling them for, an hour or two every day, and sometimes less, oftentimes less. So they have 23 plus hours of the day to just exist and live. So we want to make sure in that time they get to enjoy their lives and live as normal as a life as they can. And the best way that we can do that is to provide friends. Now, horses are obviously herd animals and do better when there are one or more. So we need to kind of figure out how to adapt that for our wild horses. And one of the best things that we can do is provide access to friends. And oftentimes that is indirectly, and I understand that does not suffice in a normal species appropriate lifestyle. But again, I have to adjust this for Mustang gentling. So that's kind of the perk of having those horses having your gentling pen in a paddock with other horses, so they can still interact and be amongst the herd to a degree. So they at least have a little bit of that social interaction. The other thing you could do is turn out in appropriate fencing. So I actually have adjusted my setup where I have a much larger space that is 6-foot fencing. And I have my training pen inside of said bigger space. So I can have a small space to gentle and train in, and then put the horse out with another untouched horse. And they could share a larger 6-foot fencing space to be able to live as wild horses, live as, a horse would, and enjoy each other's company and be able to interact and mutually groom and have social conversations, while also still being able to accommodate and go into a smaller space for training purposes. So the benefit of having friends is being able to manage what we're going to consider or call poor behaviors. Now, in reality, they are not poor behaviors, and we'll talk about this further down the road as we discuss more training, but especially with like yearlings, you can minimize that mouthiness and that play because they have another horse to do that with and interact with. And, the same thing can go for the adults as well, as they can have conversations with other horses and just be normal, have a social life, as I like to say. So having access to friends to a degree, however you can make that happen, will be so much better off for your horse and for you in your training. Lastly, let's discuss enrichment. So this is another big one. This is going to really help with confidence building, getting your horse to kind of trust their own intuition. This is a great way to provide some stimulation to your horses when you're not training and working with them. And that is providing a variety of opportunities for them to engage in their environment. And that is through horse toys or obstacles with treats on them, logs to cross and chew, or platforms to stand on. These are all really great methods to kind of change up the environment for your horse, give them something else to be interested in, to go check out, and it's going to make them more confident. They're going to be able to learn how to approach things on their own, and it's going to make a lot of elements of training a lot easier. So that's just another thing that you want to consider providing, again, while these horses are in a more confined space while they were being handled. So I hope all of this helps you guys get a feel for the sort of environment you're going to want to provide for your Mustang. I wanted to make this video so those that are considering adopting are considering all of these things. You really want to make sure you have all of these elements so that your horse is happy while they're being, confined in a smaller space. It is hard to have a horse that previously had a lot more room and a lot more freedom to be confined in a smaller area, but you kind of have to see the bigger picture, that it's not the end goal. That's why we have them in these smaller-ish spaces, so that we can get them handled, get them gentled, so that they can go out and enjoy more space in your larger paddocks or pastures. So if you have any questions on this, do not hesitate to reach out. I'd be happy to answer them. And again, this is a species-appropriate lifestyle for gentling. Thank you guys so much.